In the early 50s, my parents, Barnstormers Sidney and Barbara Shevlin Ball, and I left Cambridge for a vacation in New Hampshire. For my dad, it would be a working vacation as a member of the acting company. For a barely school-aged child, it would be an adventure. We stayed at Tamworth House, now owned by Nate Hughes, since the inn was closed. One night at dinner, Mom told me that they had a special treat for me. I would be allowed to accompany them to see a play, and it was a classic, The Ghost Train. My first play. To say I was anxious and excited would be an understatement. The anticipation heightened as the performance drew nigh. Finally, we were in the theater. The lights dimmed, and the show began. I can't tell you I remembered much of the plot of that show, but toward the end of one of the scenes, a distant rumble caught my ear. Louder and louder it came. The train's whistle sounded. The flats at the back of the stage began shaking. Crossing lights flashed and the bell rang. By now the sound was at a crescendo. The seats in the theater seemed to shake as the train thundered by the station with brakes screeching. At once the window broke, the heroine fainted, and the lights blacked out. Curtain. I was hooked. I had never had so much fun in my short life. A couple of years later, I found myself with time on my hands as my Tamworth playmates were away for the day. I wandered over to the theater to watch the stage crew as they washed and were painting flats by the Great Hill Road side of the theater. I struck up a conversation with Ed Hidden and then Linwood Dyer, the scenic designer. Lynn sensed that I was looking for something to do, so he asked me if I'd like to help paint some flats. I jumped at the chance. I spent that morning painting the flats, and myself, black. Probably they were what we call teasers today. But it was fun. My first apprenticeship. Only years later did Lynn tell me that he had me painting the back of the flats. Sometime in the late spring of 1957 or so, Frances called my parents and wondered if I might be available to take a small part in the upcoming production of Toad of Toad Hall. Wow, talk about being on cloud nine. And so I was a rabbit in the jury of the first Toad, my first performance. In 1961, I got a chance to apprentice on the stage crew for 6 productions. I soon found out how hard these dedicated technicians worked, especially on strike night. Partway through that first strike, I was suddenly surrounded by crew members and genially wrestled to the ground cloth. I was then stapled to the floor, an initiation, I was told, to the crew. I don't know whether that tradition is still carried out today, but it made me feel accepted. The following year, Frances asked me back, and I looked forward to my first full season on the crew with Linda Jennings, Bob Bates, Leslie Sharp, and many others. But it didn't work out as expected. That first strike night, Linda, Bob, and I took a load of props to the Cleveland's barn on the hill. On our return, the 4th member of our party, Spalding Gray, lit off some firecrackers right outside the inn. Then, as Linda turned the truck around near Dr. Remick's office, more firecrackers were set off. It was probably 1 a.m. in sleepy Tamworth Village. Well, we went back to work on the stage, and suddenly were startled by the stage door being wildly flung open, and there in all his anger stood Carrie Haskell, the inn's proprietor. He rightly dressed us down in words I remember to this day, but will not repeat right now. We all left the theater quite chastened that night. When the crew reported for work the next morning, it was clear something was up. We were to be interviewed individually by the state police. As the questioning began, it became apparent that this had nothing to do with fireworks. The clapper of the bell of the Congregational Church had been stolen the night before. We and others were under suspicion. One detective even asked me whether I thought Mr. Haskell might have had a hand in it, as it probably disturbed the inn's guests. But I had no idea, one way or the other. Some suggest it may be buried in the lawn somewhere behind the Tamworth Inn, but who the culprit was, and what really happened, remains a mystery to this day. Sadly, this event led to my hasty departure from Tamworth, though I had taken part in none of the shenanigans. That morning, Alice came by and told me that she had spoken to my parents, who were in Cambridge, and said that I was being sent home, not for any actions on my part, but for my protection, since a hornet's nest had been stirred up in town. It was certainly the saddest moment in my short Barnstormers career. The summer before my last year in college found the Barnstormers with a stage manager who did not follow through the way Frances expected. Shortly before I graduated, Frances called and wondered if I wanted to give stage managing a try. I jumped at the chance, though if I knew then what I know now, well, you know the rest. Needless to say, this green stage manager learned by doing, somewhat by the seat of my pants, and making mistakes, but I usually didn't make the same one again. As a kid, I hung around the theater enough to get the gist of what a stage manager does, and I took as my example Anne Batchelder, then the Barnstormers stage manager, and a role model preeminent. Live theater is an incredible experience, with things often not going as planned. Francis had a saying that helped him and us when things started to spin out of control. 11 o'clock will come. And it did. Somehow, despite the chaos of the moment, we always managed to find a way to get back on track and get the audience out by 11 p.m. So, since the audience usually never sees the backstage point of view, I'd like to share with you a few of the more significant events which transpired behind the scenes. Lines, the essence of the play. Early on in my career, we were doing The Devil Passes, and two great Barnstormers, Michael Nesmith and Nancy Halgren, were in the midst of an impassioned scene. This, luckily enough, took place down left, as we say, right next to the stage manager's area. Suddenly, one of them dried up. I quickly threw a line out, and the performance went on. But something was askew. Michael was reciting Nancy's lines, and Nancy was echoing Michael's responses. They kept this up for about a page as I stood about a foot away, unable to do anything. One or the other finally realized what was happening, and we got back on track. Another season, while doing Butterflies Are Free, the leading lady accidentally cut 8 pages from one scene, and actors who were on stage curiously exited as a rumble of footsteps from the dressing rooms led some new characters into the fray. We went on, but at intermission we huddled with Frances to see how we could work some of the plot lines inadvertently left out into an upcoming scene. We did. You see, there really is never a dull moment in live theater. And what happens if the stage manager suddenly finds himself on the boards in front of an audience? For a reason which escapes me at this writing, I was thrust into the part of the gardener in A Month in the Country, a small role opposite Deborah Buckley. Dress rehearsal night, the curtain went up on our scene, and so did I. We dropped the curtain, I looked at the script, and we went on. My mom coined the very apt phrase, "Who prompts the prompter when the prompter's on the stage and needs a prompt?" A couple of seasons later, Actors' Equity ruled that the stage manager should not be called upon to act, except in emergencies. Perhaps they had seen my performance. Check your props. A veteran actor will always check his props before the show. He may even keep a list in his pocket so he can check things scene by scene. To be caught without a prop can lead to unexpected happenings. The same goes for the stage manager. He checks things with the property master, but maintains his own list for props he must use off stage. During one performance of The Seagull, I was following the script in the final scene and came to the place where I had noted in red ink, "Load guns." I turned to my shelf to load them, and to my horror, they were not there. I had missed them in my pre-show check. I realized that the night before, for security precautions, I had taken them to my room at the Tamworth Inn across the street. I flung the script to a stagehand and raced to my room at the inn. I returned about a page before they were needed and managed to fire the shot on cue. Constantine would not have to strangle himself. Déjà vu. Many of our more popular plays are repeated at our theater. Sometimes it's not just the play which is recreated. One Friday night performance of A Church Mouse saw the actor playing the young count miss his entrance. I took off for him and saw sheer terror in his eyes as I bounded up the steps. Though it was only a short interval, the audience could see that things on stage were a bit discombobulated. About 10 years later, we did A Church Mouse again. this time with a different actor playing the young Count. That Friday night saw the same entrance missed. What goes around comes around, I guess. The set. Since a set is designed to come down within the week, sometimes the unexpected happens. We were performing Juno and the Paycock, one of our repertoire of Irish plays. As we neared the final scene, some characters tried to enter from the front door. It stuck. They tried again. Still it stuck. There were only two ways onto the set, the front door and the bedroom door. Suddenly, the entire entourage entered through the bedroom, ad-libbing some excuses about the front door. The audience found this quite humorous. At the time, those on stage did not. Is there a doctor? Doing a show, it's nearly impossible to utilize understudies. There's no time for them to rehearse. In most cases, our actors epitomize the statement, "The show must go on." Occasionally, it has briefly stopped. During When We Are Married, character actor Hal Meyer experienced a heart arrhythmia and collapsed on the way up the dressing room steps. The rescue squad was called, a doctor found in the audience. Hal recovered quickly. Francis would not let him continue despite Hal's protestations. He was whisked to Huggins Hospital, where he thankfully recovered, and director Warren Steele read Hal's part in the final act. The show did go on. 40 Carats found Priscilla Murray stricken with appendicitis the weekend before opening. She recovered, but Suzanne Steele took her role with only 2 days of rehearsal and did a marvelous job. Expect the unexpected. Ted Toll was playing a scene as a handyman with Dan Rubinate in the first Apple of His Eye. The script called for Ted to light his pipe. The kitchen match had broke, so he needed to try again. This time he was successful. He cleaned up around the desk, then left the stage as Danny came on. As Danny reached the desk, he saw flames coming from the wastebasket. Ted reappeared. Danny ad-libbed, "There seems to be a fire over there, Tude," and handed the wastebasket to Ted, who gave it to the most surprised stagehand off stage, and the play continued. Years after my first sad departure from the Barnstormers, Alice Cleveland, with a twinkle in her eye, reminded me of the event as she stated, "The boy we fired many years ago has now been our stage manager for over 20 years. The pride I felt in that statement helped me to carry on." While we worked hard, we played hard, at the Tamworth Inn and also at Mrs. Gertrude Bear's farmhouse near the Four Corners. She boarded members of the company summer after summer until into her 90s. I remember a sign she had outside the door, "We do not rent rooms to theatricals." Her sense of humor, her kind words, and advice helped us all put reality into perspective. James Elward, one of our leading men, used to refer to Tamworth and the Barnstormers as a brigadoon, a place which mysteriously reappeared summer after summer, thanks to the magic of Francis and Alice Cleveland. You know, he was right. And after all, isn't that really what this is all about? All of us, actors, technicians, box office, and board, working together to recreate the magic of live theater for you, our dedicated patrons, in America's oldest equity summer theater.